Hello and welcome to Switched On. Thank you very much for listening in. And before I start any of my podcasts, like I say, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. And today's guest, I'll give him a little intro. This chap was an undercover police officer. Part of what he did for 14 years was infiltrating drug gangs, and that meant that he was on foot, actually trying to infiltrate him, potentially as a drug dealer. And that is Mr. Neil Woods. How you doing, Neil?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on, Neil.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So, Neil, I mean, I've watched some of your interviews, and unbelievable work that you've done, working in the police, and obviously the work you do now. I just wanted to try and just sort of get a feel of it at the start and how it all sort of materialised into that. And obviously you're in the working in the drugs section for 14 years. But what got you into that, starting at the police? Did you go straight into it, or did you just start off as a?
Well, I mean, when I started in the police, I was 19, and I didn't realise how naive a 19-year-old I was. So when I went into the police, I was actually really crap at it. I mean, really terrible. As a uniformed cop, I was a bit clueless and almost got kicked out a few times. I think one of the reasons for that is I didn't deal with conflict particularly well as a young man. I'd grown up in a very sheltered town of Buxton in Derbyshire, very sleepy town, very middle class. And so it was a bit of a shock to me. So I sort of clung on there by the skin of my teeth into the job. But 2 years later, I was just starting to find my feet in the job, and then I got an opportunity to have just 1 month's attachment to the drug squad, just a month. And the reason for that is that there was a few of us getting that attachment, and the reason for that is that there was a huge political pressure to find solutions to what was seen as the drug problem. So this is 1993, and the British public was in a big moral panic about drugs. They were. I mean, we're sort of used to it nowadays. Every few months there's a newspaper story. People are calling some group of people zombies, or whatever it is. But back in '93, there was a real panic because the tabloid newspapers, for months and months, had been telling the British public there was an impending disaster, and the moment crack cocaine hit the streets, that would be it. Just the fabric of society would fall down. That's the sort of picture that.
And what year is this?
Well, that's 93.
93.
The newspapers had been running crack cocaine stories for years, really. Showing pictures.
I still see them now with London. Well, probably true. You might tell me London's the cocaine capital of Europe now.
Yeah, it is. I mean, but I mean, there's two different markets there. Crack cocaine is more your problematic users, and cocaine, powder cocaine. Well, all sorts of people use coke, don't they? So that was the backdrop, really. But when I was in that on that attachment, one of them just looked at me one day and said, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack?" And I thought, well, I wasn't expecting that question. And I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll have a go." And they gave me 20 quid. They pointed me to this blue terrace door in Derby, and I went to get it. Anyway, I went to this door, knocked on the door. This huge guy answered the door and said, "What do you want?" And I just looked at him timidly and said, "I'll have a £20 stone, please." And he looked at me and said, "Who are you? You're not a fucking student, are you? I fucking hate students." Now, at that point, I was thinking, I haven't actually got a cover story here. I have no idea what I'm going to say at all. So I'm thinking, well, if he hates students, it'd be really stupid to say I was a student, and so that'll make me believable.
Yeah.
So I said, "Yeah, that's right, I'm a student." And this woman behind him said, "Is he fucking stupid? You just told him you hate students," and he just laughed. And so then he got me inside, held out a handful of little paper twists, and so I could choose which one. And I did it, and feeling bold, I even started undoing it to see what was inside. And he says, "What the fuck are you doing?" "That's good stuff, that is." Anyway, I gave him a 20 quid. And as I was leaving, he called after me, says, "Hey, you take care now. Don't get yourself arrested," which I thought was nice, nice and considerate. But yeah, that was the first time. And I'd just gone there with no idea, no training, no backstory, not having a clue what to say, really.
It's insane.
And just sort of bumbled my way through it, really.
And it just evolved from there.
Yeah, and then that defined the next 14 years of my life. And the reason for that is just literally within the space of, half an hour of deployment, I'd come back and got evidence against somebody that drug squad had been trying to get evidence against for weeks. And suddenly, just like that, there was evidence against it. So you could see the sort of tangible excitement in the drug squad around me, who a week before, most of them had been treating me like a proper pain in the arse because they didn't want to have these attachments. They didn't want people like me getting underfoot. But suddenly they're looking at each other thinking, oh, okay. And because, that kind of low level undercover work, it hadn't happened in the UK. It wasn't going on. I mean, we'd had undercover work, sophisticated stuff where, high-end people were introduced to high-end gangsters by high-end police informants. Yeah, that's
right at the very top.
Yeah, the top end, but not working at
foot soldiers on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That hadn't happened. So suddenly, it was other jobs were hastily arranged for me, and I was going very quickly from a few days to a few weeks deployments, and then in no time at all, I was doing no less than 6 or 7 months in a city. And the reason for that is, of course, he said to me, "You take care now. Don't get yourself arrested." And really, that little conversation and confrontation at his door was actually really easy. But of course, he went to prison. And then he told other people in prison that the cops have got a new strategy out there. So everyone knew to look out for undercover cops. So with every passing week, month and year, it became more and more difficult. So then you're into the endless game where the cops have to get better at things and develop their strategies. And then organised crime are always developing ways to push back.
So what would you do then? So would you move city to city? Or would you, because obviously, just accents and things like that and drug dealers, I can imagine are probably not the calmest chaps, and they're very paranoid. What was the process? I mean, would you go 6 weeks there or 8 weeks there as soon as you've done the bust, or how's it work?
Well, the way the structure eventually happened is that I ended up working because they centralised it fairly quickly for the region, and I worked for the East Midlands Special Operations Unit. So that was a specialist covert policing unit, and then I would be loaned to constabularies that would bid for the chance to run one of those operations. So I would be loaned to a particular county, and I would stay in that place for about 6 or 7 months, just because you have to stay rooted in one place to develop it. And it's interesting, the system that developed, actually, because in the few days before I would arrive in that constabulary, and I worked as far north as Leeds, as far south as Brighton, and lots of places in between. Before I arrived there, the team, which would have to be designed in a specific way, as the MSU dictated, you would have to have someone, a techie. You would have to have an intel officer. You would have to have 2 backup team. You would have to have these various elements of the team. They all have to have these roles. So these people would be picked from whatever they do as a day job and put on this specialist job for 6 months. But the few days before it happened, they would all be gathered together and they would be given a lawful order. And a lawful order is basically, if you break this order, you'll be disciplined or maybe even sacked. And the lawful order was, they weren't allowed to ask me what my real name was. They weren't allowed to ask me where I was from. So I was using the same pseudonym to the cops that I was going to be working with as I was to the gangsters. And of course, the reason for that, because this doesn't happen in any other sphere of policing, the reason for that is that very quickly, corruption became an issue in this kind of work. And my safety became an issue in this kind of work, because obviously I was a big threat to drugs, organised crime. And the only way that they found this structure happened, where this team had to be completely separate, not in the police station. They'd have to be miles away in some temporary rented private place. That they were also ordered, you're not allowed to tell anyone what you're doing, what you're working on, or where you work. So this little secret enclave was created within the constabulary just to run me as an undercover cop.
And how old was you at this point? Very young still. What, early 20s, 19?
Yeah, I was 23 when I started it.
Did it ever concern you? And you thought, I'm giving an alias here, fake name. They can't have my real name. Did you always get the thrill of it, or did you ever get to a point where you think, oh God, I'm in deep here?
Well, I mean, it changed over time. Between the ages of, say, 23 and 29, I really enjoyed it. You know, I loved it. And there's various reasons for that. One is I really enjoyed the intellectual exercise of it. I enjoyed the intellectual exercise of being able to deceive people. You know, it sounds a bit dark to say I loved the deception. I loved being able to manipulate an entire community around me. And maintaining that lie became a very satisfying experience. And you're constantly developing because your wits are constantly getting sharper all the time. And that's a great feeling when you know you're developing. Whatever, you know, it doesn't matter what skill you learn, when you feel like you're developing, it's a buzz, isn't it?
Yeah, when you put yourself in that environment, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And another thing is it really suited my ego. I was a young man.
I was going to ask you that.
And I came across these multiple situations where I could have got myself killed, and I was coming away from it thinking, wow, so I'm one of these people that can do that. I can function well in that kind of situation. And that, when you learn that about yourself, it fuels your ego. So, and you know, and when people were, you know, some colleagues seemed even a little bit in awe of me, and you know, I got this reputation within the covert policing world. You enjoy it, don't you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll ask you about that, because only a certain type of person in that amount of pressure, especially with people that are extremely dangerous, would be able to thrive in that situation. But did it get to a point, you know, we're going to go on to stories, but what was the first time where you thought, you know, I've come a bit unstuck here, I'm going to be found out? What was the situation in the process, and what sort of what job was it, if you liked? What was there a situation you can remember the first time where you've gone in there and you thought, or did you always get that feeling it could happen, it could turn?
No, I didn't always get that feeling, because I was always overconfident, and so being overconfident is a way of mitigating risk in your own brain, isn't it? So it was always, no matter how many times it happened, it was always a little bit of a surprise when it did, if you know what I mean. But I suppose the first one was when I was working for Staffordshire in a delightful part of Stoke called Fenton. Well, it wasn't quite so delightful at the time, but certainly where I was anyway. And I'd actually got past the sort of initial trust issues. You know, I'd already had those difficult conversations and earned people's trust, and I'd got introduced to this heroin dealer who I was buying weights off quite often, not major weights, but I was buying more than your 10 bag, you know.
Yeah.
And so I thought he was quite comfortable with me. Anyway, the intelligence guy said that on this particular day, he'd seen the dealer flitting between 3 addresses which he was using in this area of Fenton, and he was carrying a samurai sword, which I thought was odd, but you know, it didn't worry me because I thought he was happy with me. Anyway, I went to this address, which I thought was probably the best bet where he was. Knocked on this door. Now, I should describe the scene. These houses in Fenton, they're like old Industrial Revolution 2 up, 2 downs, and they're a sort of step up. So when the door opens, the door is higher up than the pavement. So it's 2 steps up. Anyway, I'm looking up, and this door flew open, and the next thing I know is I've got a samurai sword to my throat. And this guy who I thought trusted me, he's screaming at me. He's saying, "You're fucking drug squad. I know you are. Where have you fucking come from? You're a fucking DS. I know you are. You're fucking heat." And his face was like really angry, blood red. And as he was shouting at me, the spots of saliva hitting me in the face. That's, you know, that's how riled up he was.
Pure anger.
Yeah. And I thought, I actually had the thought, oh, well, this is probably it then. And I just said something feeble like, "I don't mean to hassle you, mate." So something like that. And but then I hear this voice, this female voice behind him. It's this girlfriend who I'd met a couple of times. She says, "Ha, I thought he was going to say he was then." And then the two of them started laughing. They were actually winding me up. It's a good performance, I have to say. So I don't know what was going on there, really. I mean, it was probably just part of the sort of blanket intimidation and random near violent behaviour that people like that do tend to use as their reputation building, you know.
Yeah, just
If they can portray themselves as a bit of a nutter, it makes people less likely to grasp them up. Or maybe he just wanted to try out his new sword. I don't know. But that was quite close. But anyway, I asked him for that day. I think I asked him for half a tea, and then he got angry again. Said I haven't got anywhere near that weight measured out. I'm thinking it was a tiny weight. I says, well, I'll have 4 10 bags then. All right, then he said, and he gave me these 4 10 bags, and I paid him 40 quid. And then I put them in a cigarette packet, these little aluminium foil wraps. And as I'm looking up from that, there's a guy in front of me, and I look down. He's got a knife pressed towards my stomach, and it's about a centimetre away from my stomach. And he says, just give me the fag packet, man. And obviously it's someone robbing me, hanging around near the dealer's house, robbing punters. Yeah. So, I mean, God, talk about frying pan and fire. I says, and oddly, I was really calm with him. I said, close the packet up and put it in my pocket. I said, mate, sorry, I've just been through much too much to get that, so not today. And I started walking backwards really quickly. And I never forget what he said. He actually said, hang on, mate, just come here a minute. I'm thinking, no. No. And I sort of trotted backwards and then ran to the other side of a car. And it was a bit like, you know, when you play as a kid.
Yeah.
And you've got someone chasing the other side of the car and you go a bit bump the other way. And it was a bit like that for a few seconds until he just thought, oh no. And you could see his shoulders sag. It's like, oh, I failed again. Anyway, then I ran off.
That's insane. That's absolutely insane. I mean, what is so, you know, you're a foot soldier, you're just buying drugs off the street dealers, if you like. How do you get to know them? Do you just, you're walking up on the street and then you just find out where the dealers are, or you just go up to them and just front it and just go, I want to buy so-and-so? But as a police officer working in that, the street dealers are not the one. You want to climb the ladder and start to get the people that are distributing, don't you? Or you just want to, they're the key ones that you want to get? Or is that where you started? You just wanted to get the minor drug dealers first?
No, I mean, you set off with every job. You want to get the people pulling the strings, the people a step up from the street level. And that can be quite difficult because essentially in any inner city area, certainly before county lines, the way it used to work is that any dealer would have a big team of user dealers who would be selling to cover their own habit, and they would be bullied and encouraged to find more customers actually by the people above them. But those are the people that you would normally come into contact with. So, you know, you go into any inner city area and I'd find some vulnerable people, and it's always the most vulnerable people I'd go for because they're the easiest to manipulate. You know, it's the harsh truth of undercover policing. And then I'd get them to introduce me to user dealers. But then getting past them is quite tricky because what you want to be able to do is to have the sort of street credibility or reasons to be trading larger amounts so that you go to the people above them, or just the credibility for the kind of character you are, who you know, that kind of thing. So it can be quite difficult to get above them. And there's various ways that I did, but it would be the step up, the people just above them really that I would generally be after. Sometimes the step above them as well, sometimes, but for the most part I would be after the gang who would be running the user dealers in, say, half of a city. Would be my normal kind of sort of level target. And
was it mostly heroin, or was it just all? But most drug dealers, they deal the whole lot, or?
No. I was almost exclusively working in the heroin and crack cocaine markets. I mean, I did do some nightclubs for the party drugs. I did do some wine bars and buy powder cocaine sometimes, but 95% at least of my work was heroin and crack cocaine in the problematic markets. And the reason for that is that they're the markets that were targeted because they are the ones that cause the most violence. They have the most crime associated with them. And in a twisted way, really, the most problematic consumers of heroin in particular commit close to half of acquisitive crime.
Really?
Yeah. So in policing terms, that market was therefore seen as a primary target. I now realise that there's that's a quite twisted logic in the approach there, but the reality is that it's the centre of a huge amount of crime.
So you would then go to the foot soldier, infiltrate them gang, try and get the one above that, and once you done that, then you would send the police in or raid them, or is that how you used to do it? Once you got to a certain point, or
yeah, once the investigation had reached a point where I thought it can't really go much further, then it would be. I would say that I would finish off my evidence and walk away and let the team do the enforcement stage of it. That my job would be done. I'd walk away then, and then they'd start kicking the doors in, arresting people, and interviewing them.
And then you'd just move somewhere else and do exactly the same again.
Yeah, I mean, not always straight away. Sometimes I'd go to work in conventional detective work for 6 months, and then before I did another one. But essentially, yeah.
I read something about you as well. You was with is it the Burger Van Boys? Was in Birmingham? Are they a big drugs gang that I read somewhere? And you infiltrated them, did you? You got involved in that?
Yeah, that was probably my most risky job, to be honest. The one where I had the most problems. And it came at a really odd time for me because I'd actually given up undercover work at the point when they asked me to do it, and the reason for that is I found it particularly emotionally taxing. In terms of I was, let me think how long this is. I've been doing the job for 10 years by this point, and the harm that I was causing to people, vulnerable people, I was becoming more aware of and acutely aware of. And whereas I'd kept myself going, though, believing that the end justified the means.
In what way? In the way that they were being nicked and put in prison, or the way that they were violently being treated because they've been infiltrated?
Well, I'll give you an example, shall I? And I know you just asked about the Burger Bar Boys.
Sorry.
It's sort of setting the scene for the how messed up I was before I started the job, if that makes sense. I'll give you one example. I mean, I would always befriend vulnerable people, and I would befriend them. And what I call it now, looking back, weaponizing empathy, because I use my talent for empathy and understanding people against them. And so if you can imagine some vulnerable people who, and basically 2/3 of problematic heroin users are self-medicating for some kind of childhood trauma. And there's very, very good academic evidence of that. Very good evidence. 2/3. So they're self-medicating for being sexually abused or physically abused or neglected as kids. And time again, I've sat down with my new friends and they've told me, they've opened up about their lives. And it's horrific. Time after time, it's horrific. Anyway, one of these people who had a very difficult upbringing, a guy in Nottinghamshire called Cammy, I got on really well with him. And the thing is, I really liked him as well. You know, he just had a good sense of humour. He was witty, he was quick to observe things, and he was just good company. And I spent a lot of time with him and listened to him. But he was also committing offences on bail, because he was on bail for dealing heroin when I met him. And with me, he was committing those offences, so I was gathering evidence against him as well. At the end of that 7 months from that job, you know, all the gangsters were arrested, lots of people arrested, big success. But he was also locked up, and he became suicidal when he was in police custody. And the reason for that, as he told the interviewing officers, was that I was his final betrayal, because he trusted me, and he actually thought I was his one friend in the world. His one friend, that one person finally has found someone he can talk to, confide in. And I betrayed him, which I did. And, you know, he's someone that essentially needed help from someone. And so when I heard that, it was just, when I was already trying to deal with the way that I was treating people and cynically manipulating them, it was a massive blow. It was emotionally horrendous, to be honest.
Did you? Sorry to interrupt you. You know, I was just come to my mind is, did you? And you said about the empathy thing, but did you develop a real friendship, or was it just this thing you had where, you know, you was fond of this man or these people, and by the end of it, could you just switch off from that relationship and just think, you know, oh, did I like that person? Didn't I? Is there a transition between the actual people that I know and like to actually like these people? Or
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a really interesting question, because what is friendship, and how that's down to how we define it as an individual, isn't it?
Very true.
And it's about how we as an individual form relationships with other people. And so I can say I did form a genuine relationship with him, because we shared a certain sense of humour, we shared a certain sense of fun, and I was quite happy being that person to listen to him. So, if you were to define friendship in terms like that, then there's a genuine element of friendship there, isn't there? But you can also argue that it's not genuine, because I know I'm deceiving him, and so it's not a genuine friendship. But when you get emotionally entangled with anybody, you're emotionally entangled, and that can cause harm to anybody involved in that relationship, which is why, if you look at the spy cops inquiry, the scandal of the political spy cops and the undercover cops who've lived with women, even fathered children with them, and then suddenly after 5 years disappeared out of their lives. They've made some story that they've had a mental breakdown, or they're going to be arrested, they have to run away, and they never see them again. I mean, that's brutal behaviour by the state, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And that's frontline news, how these people are being treated.
It's incredible.
It is. It's hard to even get your head around, isn't it? But I caused that kind of... I caused brutal harm to people. Okay, I didn't live with a woman. I didn't pretend to be in love with her. But I did form those emotional connections. And in some ways, what I did... In some ways, I'm not comparing them completely, but in some ways what I did was even more brutal, because, as I've said, I'm talking about the most vulnerable people in our communities, the most vulnerable. And so the harm it should be seen in those terms.
How do you manage that now? Do you still feel... What do you feel about it now? Is there some sort of closure in your own head, Neil, or do you still think about it?
No, I don't have closure in my own head, because I'm diagnosed with chronic PTSD.
Right.
So I manage my PTSD, not necessarily on a daily basis, but as time goes on, I manage it. I have ups and downs which can last different periods of time. And it is chronic. I've had all the treatments you can try, and it's diagnosed as permanent. But part of my PTSD is what is referred to as moral injury. And moral injury was first documented in veterans returning from the Vietnam War, because they felt that what they'd been doing was morally wrong. And that formed part of their PTSD symptoms. Profound sense of guilt, which causes depression, and I do get that now. So no, it's not resolved.
It's just not, it's just extraordinary sort of process, which is completely not the norm, what you went through, isn't it? And I can't even imagine getting attached to someone like that, and it's all a job, but in the same time, it's real life. It's so complex, isn't it? And incredibly emotional. And yeah, it really is. It's insane. So tell me, so the Burger Van boys, and these were the big, these were based in Birmingham, were they? And these were the big sort of drug corporation in Birmingham, were they?
Yeah, the Burger Bar Boys.
Burger Bar Boys.
I mean, there are higher up organised crime groups, but the Burger Bar Boys at that point had they had the ultimate reputation, really. Them and they had rivals called the Johnson Crew, and they had an extraordinary reputation, not least of which because less than 12 months before the operation I did, they were the gang which did the double murder in Birmingham of Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris, which is a machine gunning.
Was that accidental? Was it that one? Was that?
No, there was intended to be a murder, but just they shot the wrong people.
Yeah, that's what I remember it. Yeah. I thought they shot the wrong people.
But the machine guns had been commissioned to kill somebody.
Yes, yeah,
and
not them.
So they were infamous, and they were quite a large gang. Now, as I say, I'd given up undercover work, but I got the phone call to infiltrate these, and I was resistant to doing the work again. But they said to me, and it was the DS I know really, really well, he said, look, Woodsy, we need you to do this job because these gangsters are even worse than the last lot. This team are using gang rape as part of their reputation building. And they're doing the normal kind of stuff, kidnappings, maimings, your normal kind of gangster shit, but they're also using gang rape. God. And he explained to me that they'd already tried two other operatives to get close to this gang. and they'd failed. And by this point in my career, I was sort of being used quite often as a troubleshooter, you know, for more difficult jobs. Yeah. So I was sort of guilt tripped into it. And that's quite an interesting thing, really, because I was manipulated into saying, yeah, okay.
Manipulated.
I know, I've got to do it. I felt like I had to. I felt it was my duty to do so. And so basically what the Burger Bar Boys had done is they'd taken over all of the supply, all of the market in Northampton. So they moved from Birmingham, taken over Northampton. Again, much the same is happening nowadays with sort of county lines type dealing, but it was happening then, just not in the same way. So I went to Northampton, embedded myself there, found my vulnerable people to manipulate again, and I found this really interesting couple, actually, who were on bail for dealing, which was always useful to me, and they were a couple, and they were both problematic heroin users. She was self-medicating again for childhood sexual abuse, I think. He was self-medicating for some permanent pain that he had from an accident, and he walked with a limp and a walking stick. But they were an interesting couple because they really supported each other emotionally really well. She was the best at selling the big issue in the town. Always got the best pitch. She was there at 10 to 8 in the morning outside the Marks and Spencer. She was really good at selling it. And he was a really good shoplifter, which is unusual with his walking stick. So, you know, they had enough money to keep themselves doing what they were doing. And so because the Burger Bar Boys were so difficult to get close and they controlled the whole network, I knew I had to really network very well to get an introduction to them. So I used this couple to get me to introduce me to all of the people who might buy different types of stolen goods. So if I had things like a litre bottle of vodka, I knew who to go to. If I had some computer games or electronics, I knew who to go to. And, you know, and the most important one, of course, who to sell children's clothes to. Because, you know, I'm not advocating it, but if you ever do need to get into shoplifting, children's clothes, you can always sell them because they grow up so quick, don't they?
Yep. Yeah.
So
never thought of that.
So, you know, I had to know who I could fence that with. And so I got to know this couple really well. And I manipulated them over time. And bit by bit, I started to complain to them that the people I was buying my brown from were selling me shit. I was only getting really crap £10 bags, and it wasn't as good. And I kept saying to him, I need a decent hookup, a decent proper hookup, you know. And eventually, I think it took 6 weeks. Eventually, the guy said, "Yeah, all right. Look, we've had a chat, and we'll agree. We'll introduce you to the Brummies." I thought, great, I'm in. Anyway, when he took me to meet them, he made me learn a whole new cover story of how long we'd known each other, where we'd hung around each other, where we'd done some crimes together, that kind of thing.
Wow.
So it's a peculiar situation when I'm already running a cover story in my head and someone trying to teach me another one. But anyway, we got to this place where the Burger Bar Boys were hanging out, and it was a snooker club in the centre of Northampton where they were sort of holding court in there. As soon as I went in there, I was directed into the gents' toilets. And my mate was visibly shaking by this point, literally shaking with his stick, tapping on the ground, shaking. He was pale. The door burst open and this hooded figure came in, and he went into the cubicle, stood in the toilet and looked over the door and just said, "What's this?" And he says, "Oh, this is my mate." Anyway, the door burst open again and 4 more hooded figures came in, and they started walking around me slowly. And then every so often one of them would headbutt me on the side of the head, on the ear. And then after another couple of seconds, another one would push me and the other one would elbow me as I got pushed into him. So I'm being jostled around, and it hurts when you're headbutted on your ear.
Yeah.
It's distracting.
I can imagine.
all this time, he's asking me questions, he's asking my mate questions, then he's rephrasing the questions, trying to catch me out. And this was going on and on and on, and they're still walking around me and still headbutting me. And I'm thinking, I'm not getting out of here in one piece. You know, I know the reputation of these people. And the guy in the cubicle, I knew from the intelligence, was implicated in 7 different murders in Birmingham. He's the person who sourced the machine guns for the double murder I mentioned earlier. So I knew the calibre of these people, and I just thought I'd just sort of resign myself to violence. And just as I'd resigned myself, he says, "All right then, what do you want?" And as he said that, on cue, they just walked out.
They go through this intimidation process then, just to see if you crack.
Yeah, exactly.
And are you conditioned by this time? Obviously, you'd been doing it for quite a substantial amount of years. Do you get conditioned to that environment? Because, a normal human being being surrounded and partially headbutted in the side of the head by people that are known murderers or accomplices in murder, that's not... How did you deal with that? The answer that you are, obviously, as you said at the start, you put yourself and you get better at it. And what you done, you must have just conditioned yourself.
Well, you do. You get better at it, and you learn to just sit comfortably and roll. And what I did have a slight advantage, because from discussions I've had with people over the years, I had a slight advantage in the fact that whenever I was in a situation of high adrenaline, where I was in an imminent danger, I had the sensation that time was slowing down, and that I had all the time in the world to think. And obviously it's just the brain speeding up and thinking clearer and using that adrenaline state to think more efficiently or whatever it is. But I just felt like I had all the time in the world to think. And that is strangely relaxing. It just, when you know that you can trust your own faculties and think your way through it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I suppose I got that confidence from having done it for so long. But it was still a massive, massive relief when he said, "All right then, what do you want?" And I said, "I'll have 1-on-1, please."
1-on-1? What's
1-on-1? So,
1 crack, 1 heroin.
Yeah. So I gave him 40 quid because these are people who only dealt with 0.4 deals at the time. So they wouldn't deal with you £10 blocks.
No, big time. Yeah.
Well, bigger than
the street dross. Not cases of it, but yeah, they're bigger. But so at that point then, you've exchanged. Have you got them? Or do you still need to draw them in a little bit more in regards to bigger loads of drugs?
The most important thing was me to ask him his phone number. And so I said, give me your phone number out so I can call you next time. And he put my name into his phone, which was pleasing. That was fast forwarding really to a point where it would normally take a bit longer for that to happen, another couple of months, but he put it in straight away. So that's good. And then I knew I was into them then. That was the most difficult hurdle for that job. And then I spent the next few months gathering evidence of conspiracy against the 6 Burger Bar boys who were running Northampton and everyone that was involved. And there was a lot of people involved in the town. It's an extraordinary number of people, actually. Northampton at that time had a unusually large and thriving sex worker industry. It was the hub at that time for all the other towns, for punters to go to Northampton. So that was one of the reasons why the Burger Bar boys wanted to take over the control of heroin and crack in the town of Northampton, because that made it a hugely lucrative market. Mm. So it was a busy town. And by the end of it, I'd got evidence against 96 people, including the 6 Burger Bar boys. But there was some real stumbling blocks along the way with the burgers. I'll tell you about one, because this was a really strange event. They were normally really professional, really on it. They didn't use drugs when they were working. They were really slick, very quick to be intimidating. They were quite impressive as gangsters go. But one day I met up with them, and quite often they would turn up in a car, and you'd get in the car and then you'd do the business as they drove you around and then drop you off somewhere else. And I got in the car one day, and this absolutely massive fug of cannabis smoke came out. Like, it was like an old-fashioned pea soup of fog. It was ridiculous. And I got in, and my eyes almost watering straight away. And the same guy I initially dealt with, was in the back. And just to rewind a little bit, by this time, for this operation, I called myself Woody. Now, that was a bit of weird psychology in my own head because I'd come very close to corruption previously using different pseudonyms, and almost, it almost cost me. So for this operation, it was me like sticking two V's up at the universe, calling myself a cover name, which was all close to my real name. Yeah. It was a sort of bravado to the fates, so to speak. So anyway, he said to me, as I got in the car, he says, "Woody man, why they call you Woody man? Is it because you looks like Woody Allen man?" And I'm thinking, what, really? Woody Allen? So because your brain it's just ready with the bullshit mode in that kind of work. I says, no, man, no. It's because, it's from a few years ago, my mates gave me the nickname. I said, do you remember film Toy Story? And he went, oh, yeah. I'm thinking, oh, obviously a Toy Story fan. I said, in that film, the naughty kid picks up the doll Woody, yeah, and burns his head with a magnifying glass. You remember? I went, yeah. I says, well, at that time when the film came out, I had skin cancer on my head. And
you've made this up off the cuff?
Yeah. I had skin cancer on my head and I had to have it lasered off. I said, can you still see the scar? And he's looking at my forehead going, oh, yeah. And I said, so when my mates saw that and they saw the burn in the head, they started calling me Woody. Anyway, 7 times murderer gangster from Birmingham said to me, oh, man, that's so mean.
You gotta laugh. I mean,
you've got to, but it just goes to show, when he was younger than me, and a few years before, as a teenager, I bet he didn't think. I bet his ambition wasn't to grow up to be a drug dealing gangster. No. But it's what opportunities came his way in the community and his environment. Mm. And I think it's important to know. He became one of the possibly the most vicious person I've ever met, if you go by reputation. But you have to remember, he's been shaped by his environment. I remember another gangster in Leicester, who when I first met him, he was a cheeky 16-year-old who I could get on with, dealing with heroin. The 16-year-old. 6 months later, he became a terrifying 17-year-old. And I saw that change happen over that 6 months. I could see he was making himself become more aggressive and brutal. I could see it. He was teaching himself. So by the end of the operation, he was casually knocking my head into a lamppost just to show who was the man, Really? And 6 months before, he was a little cheeky 16-year-old. He'd gone from child to man. But that's because he was in a gang that needed that reputation, so they're not the ones who are grassed up. Mm. So it's that marketplace which made him more violent. So, the funny story in the back of that car with the Burger Bar boy, I don't know where he came from, but I very much doubt as a 12-year-old he was thinking my future is as a badass gangster.
No, well, exactly. And you brought up in your societal environment, and as you say with the London issue you've got now with gang violence, they're brought up from very young kids and procured, aren't they, as young kids on bikes, etc. And they're the foot runners, and then, as you say, they've got a point to prove. They want to impress these people, and that is by violence. Mm. And it's and now, well, it's a terrible situation, especially in London. But what's your whole sort of thought process on the whole industry, the drugs industry? But do you believe that the criminal system is correctly set up in this country in order to deal with it?
Well, no, absolutely not. It is one of the greatest crises that society's ever faced, and it's the worst policy that's ever been created by a democratic society or any society. But in order to get to the point and answer that question, I should tell you what happened to the Burger Bar boys, I think.
Yeah.
Because 7 months it took, and as I said, I gathered evidence against 96 people, 6 of the main gangsters, 90 other people. So I caught all the sex workers who were runners. I got evidence against people who were stashing money, delivering drugs, whatever it was. 96 people. And I knew, actually, that I'd got no one else to catch. I'd got every single phone number. I'd seen everybody that everyone was talking about. I for the first time in any job, I thought, oh my God, I've actually caught every single person involved here. Everybody. This is going to be massive. This is going to cut the trade dead. So there were 5 different police forces provided staff for the masses of raids. And it was a huge operation. A week or so later, after the dust had settled and everyone had been arrested, the intelligence officer who was assigned to the job, who was also tasked with keeping his ear to the ground as to the impact of it, he spoke to me. He said, yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 2 hours.
But they were the biggest gang in the area, and they've all been nicked.
Yeah, that's right.
And someone else who just filled the void.
Within 2 hours, there was a new phone number. Everyone had got the new phone number. Everyone knew where to go, and everyone was supplied. Now, 2 hours isn't even enough time to rattle from heroin if you've got a problem with that drug. It's not even enough time to come off the drug. So it wasn't interrupted for a second. Now, I don't know for certain that it's the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, who took up the opportunity that was created. But you can picture the scene, can't you? Yeah. Where
rubbing their hands.
Yeah, they're rubbing their hands. You know, they get the phone call and one of them says, put the call in, boys. We're going to make a fortune. Guess what the cops have done for us? And because there's always, it doesn't matter how big a gang is, it doesn't matter who the kingpin is, it doesn't matter who you arrest or how many drugs you seize, there is always someone desperate to step into that gap and make the money. Because there's extraordinary amounts of money to be made. And, of course, that made me realise that that's all I ever do. That's all we ever do as cops.
Cycle.
Is create a gap in the market for someone else to take advantage of. We will make someone or a collection of people very happy indeed. And, of course, actually, what normally happens is that crime goes up when you have a big success like that. Because where you do create a gap in the market, more than one person wants to take up that gap and they fight, and violence goes up. And that's part of the reasons why you have got this knife crime epidemic, this violence epidemic in many inner cities. It's a result of police action. It's police success which creates those gaps in the market. Police never, ever reduce the size of the market by anything they do. Never. But police do change the shape of that market. So, and part of that even leads to an increase in corruption. And there's a mechanism here. There's a mechanism there I should explain to you. Where police create an opportunity, like I created with the Burger Bar Boys, the gang that's most likely to take advantage of that gap in the market is a gang which is already successful. They've already got a good share of a market somewhere else, and they've got the infrastructure, they've got the staff to take up that gap, yeah? So they grow. And by them growing, they have a bigger share of the market. And by having a bigger share of the market, they become richer. And if they're richer, they've got more disposable income to invest in corruption. Because if you're rich enough, a gangster, why would you not invest in corruption? Because that's how you stop yourself getting caught. You buy cops, you pay off aspects of the criminal justice system. And, you know, if anyone listening to this is dubious about the extent of corruption caused by our current drug policy, just consider what I told you about the structure that's in place to try and shield the undercover cop from corruption. Even the systems that the police have in place around investigating drugs are a clear indication of just how systematic corruption is. Because if corruption wasn't systematic, they wouldn't have to give a lawful order to those cops that they're not allowed to ask me my real name or where I'm from. They wouldn't be told that they can't tell any colleagues what they're doing or where they're working. Because if there wasn't corruption, they wouldn't have to do that. And it only happens from drugs policing. This corruption is specifically because of drugs prohibition. And that's not just because it's one of the biggest industries in the world. You use the word industry, it is the right word. It's not only one of the biggest industries in the world, worth £10 billion a year in the UK. it's not just that it's that much money. It's not just that organised crime cannot make anywhere near the same amount of money from any other kind of criminality. They can't. But it's also that ongoing monopolisation, which means that people have more disposable income to invest in corruption. And that's caused by the kind of jobs I did. That growing monopolisation and corruption. So that mechanism. So the harder we try and fight it, the more we are building in the problems, this corruption
The more it
into
develops.
society.
That's incredible. And that gets onto the methodology of it all, and the industry. How do you stop that?
Well, the only way that we will ever stop this cycle and reduce the power of organised crime is to take their business off them. Legalise, yeah. I mean, those of us in the world of drugs policy activism, we tend to avoid the word legalise because it's got this sort of traditional idea of a free-for-all.
It does, yeah.
What we're actually talking about is taking control.
Yeah.
We're taking control. We're not releasing control. We're not... people suggest, people who don't understand it suggest that legalisation will create the Wild West and a free-for-all. No. It's the Wild West now.
Yeah.
It's a completely unregulated market now where it's run by the most violent and the most ruthless people. If you take control away from organised crime, you're getting the commodities under control. So we control it like we do tobacco and alcohol. At the moment, in the UK, we have the lowest consumption of tobacco since 1940. It's been falling for a long time. The reason for that is we control it.
Yeah.
It's regulated.
Yep.
We can decide who sells it, who they sell it to, at what age, what requirements there are at that sale, for example, photographic ID, what advertising is allowed, or rather what isn't allowed, and the way that it's marketed and the way that even down to the images on packages. Alcohol, I would argue that it isn't regulated enough. But at least because it is regulated, we can have that discussion about it.
Yeah.
We can legitimately alter the taxation. We can have minimum pricing for measures of alcohol if we so wish. At least that's within our power. At the moment, for cannabis, MDMA, cocaine, whatever, the people who decide what is sold to who are the worst elements of our society.
Yeah.
And that's making us all less safe. It's the driver of the violence. It's the driver of corruption. Our children have much easier access to cocaine and cannabis than they do alcohol and tobacco. Significantly easier. And if anyone listening or watching doubts that, you've really not spoken to enough teenagers,
cocaine,
honestly.
for me, I mean, I'm 34 now, but in London, cocaine, since I was a young man, as a teenager to now, is incredible. Whether it's just opened my eyes more to it, but it's used so much by a lot of people now.
It is, and it's going up, and it inevitably will. That's the problem. But I mean, I've come a long way as a judgmental cop. As a young man, I was a moralising, judgmental cop. If I saw someone who had a problem with drugs, then I just judged them as someone who was stupid enough to have tried them, and then didn't have the willpower to deal with it. That's a horrible judgmental way of looking at things. But the reality is that 90% of people who use drugs don't have a problem with them. They don't. Same with alcohol. And the 10% that do have a problem, well, it's a sliding scale. Some people have more of a problem than others. So with such a minority of people who actually have a problem with drugs, what exactly are our drug laws for? It doesn't prevent use. There's no deterrent in our drug laws. People who want to use drugs, they'll use drugs.
And what's the statistics as well? Because heroin and crack, especially heroin, is so addictive, isn't it? And by the time these people, is it just a cycle that, the people that use it on the street, they get nicked, come back and just use it again, and they carry on going through that process?
Well, heroin is the odd one out, actually, of all the drugs. With most drugs, it's around 90% is non-problematic. With heroin, it's 75% is non-problematic.
Really?
So only 25% of people who use heroin have a problem with that drug. I know it's a startling
didn't
thing,
know
isn't it?
that.
Because modern culture tells us that anyone who uses heroin's got a problem with it.
Yeah, after
But it's
one
not-
use, that's it.
Yeah, but it's not true. It's just made up. It's just it's the bogeyman. It's just nonsense. But of course, 25% is still high,
Yeah,
and it's still a big problem for a lot of people. But it's policy which makes that a problem for society. It's not the individuals, because in the UK we used to have a pretty good drug policy, so that if somebody had a problem with a drug, they could go to a doctor and they would be cared for and they wouldn't have any moral judgment. So for heroin, what that meant was a doctor would just prescribe them heroin, so that then they don't suffer the problems of being exploited by organised crime.
Yeah.
It's just a pragmatic, basic, non-judgmental way of dealing with it.
It's very true. And the contents issue as well, because everything's underground and things contain all different stuff now.
Exactly. So it's significantly safer. Now, so many people will just recoil at that very idea, and what will come to their mind is, no, what's wrong? We can't just give free drugs to people. But think about what it actually means. I mean, up until the point when that ended in the UK, at the end of the 1960s, there was 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK. 1,046. And the number was falling. Within 20 years of ending that system and handing the whole heroin market to organised crime, the number went up to 300,000. The epidemic was caused by ending the system of treating it as a health issue. And that's when our problems started. So, and those figures, you can't argue with those figures. They're well documented. But there's a very clear cause and effect there. Very clear. So the answer logically presents it to us through that. Now, no matter how much it causes you to recoil and offend your sensibilities if you're listening to this, we're talking about a better society here. We're talking about less crime. We're talking about ending the system that empowers bullies, that exploits vulnerable people who need help. And remember that there is very good evidence that that people who have a problem with heroin, they're self-medicating for childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And we should be caring for them with whatever they need.
It's very true. It's like I always use the sort of analogy of someone on the street, and everyone just goes, oh, well, that's a guy on the street. He's done this, he's done that. Well, no, there's a chance he's had a real shit life, and he's been brought up and he's had a real short end of the straw. And it's the same with these people that fall, and people on the street actually fall into becoming addicts. And it's just an alleviation for that stress and mental stress that they have. But people don't look into it in that complex way. It's either that or that. And they shouldn't be doing that. Take it away from them. Or they shouldn't be, Could you see it ever changing? Could you see this methodology coming into play where they not legalise, but put it and change the policies? Because they've got the stats and figures, as you say. So could you see it happening? I mean, it's happening with marijuana now, isn't it? That's coming into play where they're starting to legalise that. It's already taking place in some parts of America and Canada.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an activist.
Yep.
And so I have to remain optimistic, otherwise it would probably drive me even crazier than I am already.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I do think it will happen because there's various aspects of policy which are already changing. You've mentioned cannabis. We use the word cannabis, by the way, because the reason that the Americans changed it to marijuana was part of the racist policy. They wanted to. The reason they banned cannabis in America was during the Great Depression, really, because Mexicans were seen to be stealing white jobs. And so by criminalising cannabis, which was seen as slightly more predominantly a Mexican pastime, it meant that they could criminalise Mexicans.
Wow.
So there's famous photographs at the time and on shop doorways, no dogs, no Spanish speakers. There was a real hatred towards people coming from Mexico stealing white jobs. So making cannabis illegal was a way of criminalising people out of their society. And they changed the name from cannabis to marijuana to make it sound more foreign. So they built the Spanish word for it to make people think of a Spanish pastime. So that's why they call it marijuana, and why the rest of the world calls it cannabis.
Well, I never knew that.
But all drug policy is based on racism. It's all based on American racism. It's essentially American domestic racism exported across the world with aggressive foreign policy. So I've mentioned cannabis, opium. Opium was banned only because they used Chinese immigrants to build all the railroads. When the railroads had been finished in California, there were loads of Chinese, former Chinese nationalities looking for jobs, and white people didn't like that. So they criminalised opium, which was seen as a Chinese pastime, even though opium was being used by middle-aged white women for various ailments for their family because there wasn't many other medicines available. It was a medicine.
We used to use it in Victorian times.
Yeah,
too.
It was being used by everybody, but it became a weapon to criminalise an ethnic group. So that's why they did it.
Very common, yeah.
Cocaine is another one. So at the end of the Jim Crow laws, when the Jim Crow laws came in, so the end of the American Civil War, the southern states for decades and decades, well, up until this today, if you look at it one way, for decades were very resentful of the fact that blacks were meant to be considered equal citizens. So there was systematic and organised ways of fighting back and criminalising black people. And one of the most effective ones was by criminalising the use of cocaine. So in 1919, there's various newspaper stories in the southern states with things like basically horror stories of black people on cocaine and how it made them superhuman and how it took like multiple bullets to bring them down, that kind of story. Yeah. And essentially the criminalising of cocaine was to persecute black people and to put them in prison. Because you put them in prison, you can use them as slave labour. So cocaine was probably the most important, certainly in the early 1920s, the most important law to do that by southern states. So even alcohol prohibition between 1919 and 1933, even alcohol prohibition was about persecuting a minority, because the traditional political power base in America is puritanical Protestant. And there was an influx of Catholic immigrants from Italy and Ireland. And they were seen as communities that used more alcohol than the Protestants, and they probably were. Yeah. So alcohol prohibition was about persecuting Catholics. And there's some famous posters and literature from the beginning of alcohol prohibition. It's all churned out by the Ku Klux Klan. And you see these cartoons of the Pope being destroyed and the Pope drinking his alcohol and the Ku Klux Klan surrounding him, all teetotal. It was about persecuting Catholics. So whatever the drug, it's all been about American domestic prejudice. And so that's how they got those laws enshrined. But the problem is, at the end of the Second World War, every single country was significantly poorer than they were before, apart from the United States, because everybody owed the United States money. The United States bankrolled the Second World War, and we owed them incredible amounts. It was only paid off in the 2000s, really? Which meant that in the United Nations, America became a genuine superpower, a genuine, because they could increase their interest rates to anyone who didn't fall into line.
So as this was the transition, then this is what made them into this big nation,
and the way that
we see now.
Exactly, and the way that they flex their muscles and impose their will on the rest of the world is through drug policy. So our drug policy is because of American domestic racism. It's nothing to do with the drugs. It was never based on any evidence of the harms of the drugs. So the ideas that we have now of how dangerous cocaine might be, or how dangerous various things are, or how addictive things are, none of it has any basis in fact at all. Because
no scientific, nothing.
There's no scientific basis at all for drug laws. I've listened to the entire debate for the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is 50 years old this year, by the way. It needs to be repealed. I've listened to the entire debate, and there's not one reference to science in it. It's absolute. It's batshit crazy what they're talking about. Honestly, you have the occasional MP that talks about, well, won't this be like pouring oil on a shed fire? Which is a strange phrase, but at least the occasional MP is a bit nervous that actually, aren't we going to cause problems here? But it was all about government doing what the Americans wanted and falling into the line with the United Nations conventions, which were essentially the Americans bullying the rest of the world. There's no foundation, no science basis at all. And in fact, the first ever comparison of harms between drugs, I think, was done in 2010 by Professor David Nutt, or 2007, something like that. It was published in The Lancet, and it shows very carefully comparing the harms of different drugs in a list. And at the top, no great shock, is alcohol. And it's significantly worse. And then you've got heroin and you've got cocaine. But then after those, the rest of them drop down to very few harms. So you have this very small column all the way down. And most drugs have got really small harms. To the ones at the bottom, they've got virtually none at all, like LSD and psilocybin from magic mushrooms.
Yeah.
So, but people don't have any idea that LSD is so harmless. They have no idea because the story that they've been told
propaganda.
by the drug laws is propaganda.
I picked up on it, and as I said, you take one shot of heroin and you're addicted. That's what's instilled into my brain. And some people saying you picked up on it, and I've heard that many times. You take cocaine and they're going to be 10 times stronger and they're going to beat the shit out of 10 men. It's true.
It's nonsense. It's not, even the sort of societal trope where you'll hear people saying, "Oh no, cocaine turns you into a dickhead." Well, alcohol turns a few people into dickheads, but it depends on the personality, and it's no different with anything else.
What about normal painkilling drugs? Aren't people more addicted to them nowadays than?
Well, I mean, no, not really.
No?
I mean, look, you can become habitualized to a drug if you're using a pain-killing drug which you take every day. So, like, we're talking about opioids essentially.
Yeah.
The class. If you're taking drugs, which you build up a tolerance to and you build a reliance to, because for one, if you remove the drug, you've still got the underlying pain. So the drug seems like it's not a good decision to stop taking it. But also you get an increased tolerance with it. And if you stop taking it, you will have a period of time of discomfort, and then the pain returns. So does that mean that you are addicted to it so that you feel like you have to take it forever because of the chemical hook? Or does that mean that you're in an uncomfortable position where there are withdrawal effects and you still got the pain? You have to put this into context. It's, what are we talking about here? You're not talking about a situation where you're being slowly driven insane by something which is out of your control. It's just a set of circumstances where opioids have their problems with their withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah.
Addiction is not what people think. Addiction is not a chemical hook. Addiction is caused by trauma. Now,
So the tendency of addictive personalities and your natural genetics is caused by what's happened to you?
Yeah, that's not. It's not what the evidence says. The evidence doesn't suggest it's by genetics. It's about what's happened to you. Right. Now, there's a famous experiment by Professor Alexander in Canada in the 1970s, and he called this rat park because our modern idea, psychiatry's idea of what addiction is, was based on rat experiments where you put a rat in a cage and you give them two buttons. It knocks one button, it gets some water. It knocks another one, it gets some cocaine water or heroin water. And you put the rat in the cage and it keeps going, and after a few days it keeps going to the heroin water or the cocaine water until it kills himself. It's addicted. And so this informed our idea that it's about a chemical hook. But then Bruce Alexander thought, no, well, this is a bit crap. I think if I was stuck in a cage, I think I know what button I'd go for as well. So he did this great thing called Rat Park, where he had this massive area where all the rats had things to play with, other rats they could have sex with, everything they need, really. Yeah. Nice food.
Like a human.
Other rats to hang out with, yeah. Exactly. And it did the same experiment. He had the two buttons, the one with water, the one with the drug. And in almost every case, they'd try the drug once or twice and then leave it alone and just go for the water because they had everything they need. And so it's quite reasonable to apply that to human ideas of addiction. that people are replacing something that they need. And you can do that. But you also have to understand what leads to that feeling of emptiness or feeling of trauma. And there is good evidence that actually things that happen to us in our childhood are the triggers for addiction. So, in other words, if we see someone who is having a problem with a drug, we shouldn't be looking down on them. We should be asking the question, what happened to you?
Yeah, 100%. We don't do that enough in society. We don't do that with people that need help as much. It's always cut and dried and they're judged.
Exactly. And, if you wanted to design a system which made life as difficult as possible for someone who might develop a problem with drugs, it would be the system we have now. Because, people worry about the numbers of people who might use drugs. And so my opponents who say we should keep the same system we have now, they say, no, if you sell drugs legally, then more people will use them. Well, not necessarily, because I already used the example of smoking tobacco. That's been reduced. But actually, with most drugs, why would we care? Why would we care if another extra million people started using cannabis? Why? Because the numbers of people using drugs, that's not the number you need to worry about. The number you need to worry about is people who use drugs problematically. And just because more numbers of people might use drugs, that doesn't mean there will be more people using problematically. And actually, criminalising people makes it more likely that they will use drugs problematically. It also makes them more likely to be exploited by bullies, by gangsters, to use more drugs, sell drugs to other people, find more customers. And that's where you get the epidemic of problematic drug use, because of the system we have.
These archaic rules, and it's very complex, and it's certainly opened my mind what you're saying, but it makes complete sense. If you take that whole criminal syndicate out of the equation, prostitution, drugs, murders, it's all surrounded by drugs. And I am more of the wanting to look into that, because it just seems like it's just getting worse. Is that what you do now as an activist now, banging on the doors of the legislators trying to change this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm part of a growing international organisation called the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I'm on the board of the organisation in the United States. I'm also on the board of the group that's forming in Europe, Leap Europe, and also I'm chair of Leap UK. But I'm only one part of that growing organisation, and I'm pleased to say that we are growing across borders. We really are rapidly growing. And our organisation is exclusively police and other law enforcement who have been involved in this drug war. We're the foot soldiers who are putting our weapons down, saying enough's enough. It's time to declare peace. And we do have an influence. We do influence politics. And you're right, I spend a lot of time meeting with politicians, doing political advocacy. But much more important than the politicians is the people listening to this. Because this is a social justice issue. You can compare it with other social justice issues in history, such as the illegality of homosexuality, for example, or the gender pay gap, or the death penalty. These policies didn't change by political leadership. They changed through the growth of social movement. And drug policy is no different. It will change by the social movement growing enough, for people caring enough to do something about it, to then influence their politicians. To say to their politicians, we will vote for you if you bring in progressive drug policy. That's what I'm looking for in my politicians, and that's how it will change. I mean, we've got... So, I mean, anyone listening to this who is persuaded, who already understood the need for drug policy reform, or who is now persuaded, please, you are now part of that social movement. And as part of that movement, please do whatever you can to help this movement grow, even if that's just persuading your family, even if it's just sharing our social media posts of Leap, or any of our allies, or like people like Anyone's Child, or any of the other wonderful reform groups. Do what you can, because that's how we make this ripple in the pond grow bigger. Now, we have a significant problem in making that social movement grow, though. It's a stumbling block that other social justice issues didn't necessarily have, and that is that the police, when they have what they consider to be a big success, like the kind of jobs I used to do, they'll press release it, and they put out these images all the time in the press and social media nowadays as well of the big drug seizure. Yeah. You know, like the National Crime Agency will say, this is the biggest cocaine seizure ever since the last one or until the next one. or you'll have your local safer neighbourhood teams in Coventry or Camden or wherever showing a seizure of a cannabis grow. Or they'll show a series of mugshots of people who were arrested running county lines. You know, all these images, we recognise them all the time. All the time. It's the same image. But if we were talking about an international business, it would be the most successful marketing strategy of all time. Because the police are putting out the same images in America, the same images in South Africa, same images in Australia, and they're repeating these images. And the public are constantly seeing these images, and what they're feeling from that is, oh, current policy's working. Look, the police are doing something. Look, they're telling us that this is keeping drugs off the streets. They're telling us that this is making a difference. Look, these images, they're so impressive. Look at that image of the door being smashed in at 6 o'clock in the morning. That must mean current policy's working because they're catching people. But as I explained earlier, the police never reduce the size of the market. So the police putting out these images, it's a lie. It's a big fat lie. Now, that's not the case with everything else the police does, because if the police catch a burglar, house burglar, in any community, burglaries will go down. So the police can legitimately claim that as a success in what they tell the public. If they catch a drug dealer or seize a load of drugs, crime generally goes up. It never goes down. Never. Because they've not had any impact on the supply. No one is going without their cocaine. Doesn't matter how many tons the NCA seized this week. No one's going out without their cocaine. No one's even paying a penny on the gram more. They're not. It's not even dropping in quality. Never. The seizures are just normal business losses. Probably around 1%.
And they expect that, don't they? They put it in.
They expect it. I mean, they're writing off, the international cartels are writing off less percent in business losses than Marks and Spencer's writes off for shoplifting costs. That's how small these business losses are. So it's a big fat lie that's being perpetuated on and on and on. And that lie is slowing down the social movement because the public are lulled. So something that we've done with our allies recently, and I would love people's support in this, is we've, together with Anyone's Child, we created a little video. It's Twitter length. It's only like 2 minutes. And it's just explaining that these drug busts have no impact. So this video, basically, it's designed as a tool. You know, so often I speak to audiences and they say, oh, God, yeah, you've convinced me, but what can I do? Well, this is something you can do. This is something anyone can do. Because when you see a police social media account posting a little picture of success, some seizure, some cannabis grow, whatever it is, post this video politely and ask them to watch it, post it in the comments. And even if it's already posted there, post it again and post it again and again, because repetition's important. Eventually, this message will get through to the people operating police social media accounts. And, you know, it will help because we're already trying to talk to those people. So, you know, the more times this can be used, the better.
And what you've said, I mean, and there's propaganda that comes out in the media and the way it's portrayed. And as you've just put it perfectly, you know, we see that, they're actually doing work. But, you know, it's and I find it as well, with the public, they tend to just look at what they read and then cast their opinion upon that. Whereas I feel like it might be changing now, and especially in the matter and all what you've been explaining, it's very complex and takes people to actually look into it. And then it gives you that very conclusive information, what you've just told me. But I find people just look at something and go, no, that's it. You know, they'll see that and and that's in their mind there. Oh, that something's being done. But it really is. It's sort of opened my mind in some of the stuff that you've said. It really is. And you know, I've only seen, especially in London, and sort of the epidemic of gang violence you've got now, which is all drug related, and of course you've got Albanian gangs now. Apparently, is what's portrayed in the media. Don't know if you know anything about that, but with the cocaine industry now in London, and it just seems to be getting more severe.
Yeah, I mean, the Albanian thing. Yes, it is true that Albanian gangs have dominated a lot of the powder cocaine market in recent times, but you know, what I read in the press though is problematic with that, because you know it becomes a xenophobic thing, and it becomes a problem that's caused by foreigners rather than just thinking, well, the market exists. Whoever is canny enough to make the best use of that business, well, you know, that probably makes them smart rather than a foreign scourge. You know, it's just the way it's framed in the newspapers. And Albanian gangs do dominate certain things, and depending on which information source you trust, certainly from some police sources I've heard, is that the Albanians have been quite clever in terms of cutting out the middleman, and that's made a difference in price and purity of powder cocaine as well.
And it's just what you said, you know, it doesn't matter who it is within the country. It's always going to be imported. There's always going to be that service there, and someone is always going to fill that void.
Always.
In the policy and the current methodology that we have, it's worrying.
It is, and also, you know, we should think about our international responsibility, because the demand for cocaine, for example, in this country, it causes all sorts of problems in South America.
Yeah,
but the political recent political way of trying to blame individuals who use a particular drug for that problem is just, again, it's a deception, because it's policy that's brought us here. It's policy that can change. You know, you can't blame the individual plumber or the individual. They like to paint the picture it's going to be a middle class cocaine user that's causing all the problems, and that's such bollocks, isn't it? You know, there's all sorts of people like a line of coke on a Friday night or whatever. You know, as I say, and I've come a long way from the judgmental cop I used to be. I judge no one for their choice of drug taking. Now I'm a firm believer in personal liberty, that the ultimate freedom is what we do with our own mind and body. And everything should start with that.
Yeah.
And a failure to recognise that is what's got us to this mess. That's what prohibition is. So it just knocks me sick that politicians will blame the individual.
Yeah.
When it's the politics which is interfered with that individual's freedom.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's the way things are portrayed, and even in some of the stuff that I brought up to you, and you just told me it's bollocks. You know, it's the what's instilled, and even some of the stuff my parents say, and it is. It's amazing, and these complex issues just need to be looked into more. It really does. And I will ask you, so I've got to ask you this, because I've rewind a little bit from what we've been talking about. Are you made to take drugs, or do you have to take drugs as a, you know, you not have to because it's illegal, but have you ever taken them as part of understanding what you're dealing with?
Not as part of understanding, no. I mean, I had to a few times when I was working undercover. A few times cannabis, but I mean, that's just cannabis, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there was one time that I made a really stupid mistake, to be honest. It was quite early on in my career, and I was infiltrating this pub, which was full of gangsters. It was a weird place because it was in this little village in Leicester called Whitwick, and there were gangsters meeting from Derby, Nottingham and Leicester. And it was like almost a cartoon version of a pub, a gangsters hangout, you know. It was ridiculous. All this kind of trading that was going on in there, and stolen cars and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines, which I can tell you I'm not at all. But it just seemed like something to talk about, you know, because I'd been reading lab reports and, you know, things like that. Anyway, after several weeks, the main man in there came up to me and said, "Hey, you, I've got a present for you." And held up this little Sealy bag with this toxic-looking pink goo in it. And you could almost see it dissolving the bag. You know, it was so. And the smell of it, it smelt like the urine from a glue sniffing cat. It was a really, really brutal smell. And anyway, he handed it to me, and the problem is, I had a very momentary reticence just flash across my face, just that split second. As I say, it was young. It was early on in my undercover career, and the trouble is, he picked up on that momentary reticence, which created the beginnings of a suspicion, and I picked up the beginnings of that suspicion on his face.
So now you've got to go through it.
So then I think, well, I've got to pour water on that suspicion quickly, very quickly. So I snatched, right. So put my little finger in, scooped a bit out, put it in my mouth, swallowed it, and try not to spew. And he said, "You'll need more than that with your tolerance."
Oh, no.
I thought, oh, great. So I put my finger in and got another load and swallowed it. And in no time at all, I was at this sort of real glowing feeling in my belly. And I put it in my pocket, and after just a short time, I made my excuses to go because I could feel things happening. And I had to get to the safe location, explain what had happened, dictate my notes quickly, and then it was arranged that I was going to get driven home, and the car that I was with was going to get driven by someone else. And, you know, as it came up, it was absolutely appalling. It was a horrendous feeling, because the trouble is I didn't have any tolerance at all. And most amphetamine at that time was 5% pure. This was 40% pure. It was proper base amphetamine. And I'd had quite a lot. Now, I was confident enough that I understood the drug, that I wasn't in risk of overdosing or anything. You know, you have to take a hell of a lot of amphetamine to be doing yourself some serious injury. But that didn't mean I was having a good time. No. It was the most extreme angst. And I remember being driven home thinking, I've got 8 cans of beer in the fridge. 8 cans of 5% lager. That'll take the edge off this. That'll be fine. Anyway, I'm sat there, 8 cans empty. 8 cans later, no impact at all, and I'm still feeling like horrendous. Trying to distract myself with something interesting on the TV, but everything's driving me mad. I didn't sleep properly for 3 nights. Wow. 3 nights. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy since.
You're just constantly cleaning night and day for 3 days straight.
Well, the first couple of days anyway.
Yeah,
something to do, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we've been going on an hour and a half now, and honestly, it's where can people find you, Neil? Your website and everything like that, and your activist work, social media.
Well, there's a few things here. Most important is my organisation. So people can find Leap UK on Facebook, and on Twitter and Instagram we are at UK Leap. In America, we are the Twitter is at Police for Reform, and then there's the Leap Europe, Leap Scandinavia, Leap Germany, Leap Australia. You know, if you want to follow the lot, retweet them all, please do. Then my own website is neilwoods.net, and my own Twitter is at Woodsy0. Now, it's a stupid Twitter handle, but I did it before I knew I was going to go public. So,
well, I'll make sure I put it in the description messages. Honestly, it's been such a fantastic podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Neil. It's been so informative. Really has. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
Make sure you tune into the next episode. Thank you.